I now declare open the 14th plenary meeting of the second session of the Ad Hoc Working Group on the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action.
The talks chipped on familiar difficulties between rich and developing nations over how to share the responsibility for carbon emissions cuts and the amount of climate finance developed countries should give in coming years.
For us to get there, there is a lot more that has to be done. It's going to be costly, but you can't put a cost to human lives, you can't put a cost to livelihoods, you can't put a cost to coastlines disappearing, and I think that's what we have to realize, that it might be expensive, but it has to be done.
The text, breaking deadlock among weary delegates almost 2 days into overtime after 2 weeks of talks, appeased developing countries led by China and India, concerned that previous drafts imposed too heavy a burden on emerging economies compared to the rich.
So we are very close to have and to build the basis and the open foundation to have success in Paris.
The Peruvian environment minister, who served as the president of the Conference of the Parties, announced the approval of the deal, which was reached after intensity on a military base in Lima. The deal at the end of the 2-week talks also make it clear that rich countries would have to provide financial support to developing countries. The document also satisfied rich nations led by the United States, who say it is time for fast-growing emerging economies to rein in fast-rising emissions. China is now the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, ahead of the United States, the European Union, and India.
First of all, and I hope you can support this idea, I think that would be a good idea, if you agree, to call this document the Lima Call for Climate Action. So if you agree, it is so decided.
The way that we were able to deal with that issue between the U.S. and China in the joint announcement of a few weeks ago actually ended up coming in quite handy here. And Minister Xie and I were able to offer that language up in effect and it has found its way into this text as a way of kind of getting through that difficulty. So that was quite useful. I think there were a bunch of things. That's just one of many, just one that comes to my mind. But there were a number of provisions, a number of issues that were points of contention, which just got worked or another during the course of the day.
Some environmental groups, however, slammed the deal.
This is an incredibly weak text. The parties have just clapped through something that is going to lead to all voluntary submissions of information, all voluntary ideas from countries about what kinds of emissions reductions they want to make. And the big picture is, when they're done, it's going to be very hard to know if we're actually able to avoid dangerous climate change or not. So we came in here on a wave of optimism. We had these announcements from the US and China. We had lots of good announcements from countries in Latin America about renewable energy, about protecting forests. And where we are now is that we have a weak text, and we're going to have an incredibly hard road towards Paris if we want to get a good global deal.
Justice, no deal. No justice, no deal.
Some 50 environmental activists gathered outside the climate talks in Lima to express support for the global downtrodden.
We are standing in solidarity with all those people who are most impacted by climate change. And that was our action about what we currently see is injustice. So we were calling for justice, and we can't agree to a deal if there's no justice.
Most of the tough decisions about how to slow climate change were postponed until next year's meeting in France. The United Nations climate chief also considered the Lima deal as a good beginning.
I believe that we have seen over the past 5 years, but certainly here, that policy is catching up with science, definitely moving forward, and much remains to be done in Paris next year. But I think a very, very important step in all of the different issues that now the COP president has enumerated already, policy catching up with science.
Central to the United Nations annual round of talks are nationally determined plans by nations to reduce emissions to prevent global temperatures from rising to 2 degrees centigrade on pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. Greenhouse gases have risen 45% since 1990, with temperatures climbing 0.85 degrees centigrade since the Industrial Revolution.
We already know, because we have a pretty good sense of what countries will be able to do in the short run, that the sum total of efforts of both governments and non-state actors will not be able to put us on the path for 2 degrees next year. It will take several iterations or several generations, if you will, several harvests of efforts of countries every time with increasing ambition, such that every time the gap between what science says where we should be and where we are, that gap will get smaller and smaller until we reach the ultimate objective of decarbonization, which is climate neutrality in the second half of the century. But we're not going to get there with the Paris Agreement, with the numbers that will be there next year. We will get there over time.
Thank you, Co-Chair.
The idea of a UN deal with obligations for all nations marks a shift from the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which obliges only the rich to cut emissions. The United Nations Climate Secretariat said that the combined pledges by all nations likely in Paris will be too weak to achieve a goal of limiting warming to an agreed goal of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. Under the Lima deal, national pledges will be added up in reports by the 1st of November 2015 to assess their aggregate effect in slowing rising temperatures. But after opposition led by China, there will not be a full-blown review to compare each nation's level of ambition, and the text lays out a vast range of options for the Paris Accord, including the possibility of aiming for zero net global emissions by 2100 or earlier, in a drastic shift from fossil fuels towards renewable energies such as wind and solar power. According to climate experts, as it stands, 21 years of tortuous negotiations may have actually taken developing countries backwards in tackling climate change. From an imperfect but legally binding UN treaty struck in 1992, in which industrialized countries accepted responsibility and agreed to make modest but specific cuts over a defined period, there is now the prospect of a less than legally binding global deal where everyone is obliged to do something, but where the poor may have to do the most and the rich will be free to do little. In 1992, rich countries were obliged to lead and to help the poor, but now there is a situation where those who had little or no historic responsibility for climate change are likely to cut emissions the most.
The United States and China.
The United States Secretary of State John Kerry made an impassioned speech in Lima, warning that the world was on a course leading to tragedy.
The United States and China, two countries long regarded as the leaders of opposing camps in these negotiations, have now found common ground on this issue. That is a historic milestone, and it should send a clear message to all of us that the roadblocks we've hit for decades can be removed from our path.
But inside the conference halls, the United States negotiators were not given an inch during the negotiations. And the emissions cuts that the U.S. proposed would put the world on a path for a global temperature increase well beyond the already dangerous 2 degrees centigrade. Countries now have little time to resolve fundamental issues, and success in Paris is not at all certain. All countries will be asked to submit their plans for curbing greenhouse gas emissions, known as intended nationally determined contributions, to the United Nations by the 31st of March 2015. The UN will then crunch the figures, and a few weeks before the talks open, it will be revealed how far away countries are limiting temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. As it stands, there are warnings that the world may be on track for a 4 degrees Celsius warming. But with more than 100 countries supporting the ambitious goal of phasing out all man-made carbon emissions by 2050, Paris will see a massive showdown. From now on, the stakes only get higher, led by China, Africa, and the least developed countries see weak and unjust climate targets from rich industrialized countries, and over the next year, they will exert as much pressure as they can to establish a fair and equitable way to share out what is left of the global carbon budget. But as Lima showed, they are now working together and are unlikely to sign up to what they think is a meaningless deal.
Give me the great pleasure to...
The other problem docked in Lima was finance. Developing nations wanted rich countries to set a clear timetable to scale up the funds available to help them adapt. But the final text merely requested that rich countries enhance the available quantitative and qualitative elements of a pathway towards 2020. Because the industrialized countries have already promised to secure $100 billion a year after 2020, developing countries will want cast iron assurances about how this will be achieved, given that rich countries have so far pledged only about $10 billion to run over the next 5 years. The gap may be too great and the likelihood of failure in Paris is high.
So if you agree, it is all decided.
Unless the rich countries take care in the negotiations, experts warn at some point it will become clear to developing countries that no deal may prove better than any deal. From Lima, all attention is now on Paris and the benefits it will bring. And that does it for us here on Earthfile. Thank you for being a part of it. From me, Ayola Kasim, and the rest of the team, do have yourself a Merry Christmas.